Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, which, while a funny title, let's be honest guys, it didn't come out that far away from those remakes, which are the main reason this game even exists, as they showed there was still a big interest in this property, and also to some extent that they could make a Crash Bandicoot game for modern audiences. But could they? It's one thing to remaster all the levels keeping the spirit of the original with the same level design and aesthetics, but creating a whole new game with its own ideas and level design, is this something that Toys for Bob could do? Well, I'm not gonna try and pretend this game hasn't been out for a year and it's considered by a lot of people to be a really good game, but how good and how good maybe for you is what I hope to try and tell you during this review. Starting then with the story, probably the least important piece of this type of platformer, but it is, if not anything else, interesting in its choices. It's a sequel to the Insane trilogy, and so also a sequel to the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy, which I guess retcons all the PS2 games with that number 4, which to be honest I don't think anyone was very disappointed with. The actual story though involves dimensional rifts and new masked characters, and it's all very clearly in service of the gameplay and its scenarios, and that's fine, especially when there are some payoffs here for longtime fans with the characters and their interaction, especially Neo Cortex, and it's all just very light-hearted and somewhat comedical. No one is going into this game expecting a deep and enthralling story, but what it does and should do is set and justify the locations and gameplay settings, which I already said it does, so let's move on to that. The gameplay, the most important part of any Crash Bandicoot game, and it's definitely the one it's had the most troubles with throughout the years, with its quality wavering ever since it left Naughty Dog's hands in the early 2000s. But the remake was a big step in the right direction, and this one is as well, not only having good and well flowing level design, but also adding new gameplay mechanics. First, let me try and describe well-flowing levels. It's hard to describe if you have not played it, but there is a rhythm to the levels, like you can always just keep moving forward, and there's nice transitions between the 2D and the 3D platforming segments, and of course, the way crates and other collectibles are located in such a way that they're actual challenges to get to, this time around feeling a lot more justified, as it is something that it's more for the people looking to 100% and master the game, rather than getting lives or just finishing the game, as we saw with the original trilogy. And this was also a decision made in the Insane trilogy, so it was expected to see it here. I personally prefer it, as I really just want to get to play all the levels at a nice pace, and this approach really leads to that. Now, in terms of level structures, like I said before, they change between 3D and 2D platformer, these levels being very reminiscent of original Crash, where bottomless pits are a lot more dangerous than the actual enemies, as enemies that wait for you to get close and attack are easy to outrun, enemies that chase you are also easy to outrun, and then most other enemies have simple, cyclical attacks that are easy to avoid. Honestly, the hardest enemies are the ones that create an insta-kill radius attack, and while this may sound like a negative, it is not, as again it helps with what I said before of creating that rhythm, and making these enemies too complicated would, I think, contradict that philosophy, which I personally like, except of course for those shocking radius enemies, they suck. Boss fights are also really good, surprisingly. In fact, they may even be better than the original games. In my opinion, they managed to be faithful to that classic arena where you dodge attacks until you get an opening to attack yourself, but here there's a big difference, being, well, it's a lot more graphically impressive of course, and there's just a lot more going on, which allows for complex attacks that really just turn these boss fights almost into bullet hell games. But there is one difference I think it's even more effective in changing the dynamic of these boss fights, and that is the opening for your attacks happening during while the attacks are still happening. It really helps with the challenge and again the pacing, as usually this type of boss fights tend to just stagnate in the in-between phases. Usually the only tension coming from not wanting to mess it up and having to repeat it all. And well, this fixes that. The breathing room is still there, but now after you actually hit the boss, which I think makes a big difference. Now talking about our main characters, most levels will be played of course with Crash or Coco, basically the female version. They play the same, so it's really a preference thing. They can jump, double jump, and do a spin attack, and also slide, and with the same button as the slide, crawl. But the more interesting piece of their moveset and overall gameplay of Crash 4 is the new masks that will appear throughout the game in specific moments, adding new powers to our main characters. There are 4 of these. Yes, I know, very deep. 4. But anyways, first starting with the Lani-Loli phase mask. This mask allowing you to phase between realities, so to say. It's not the whole level, but objects in the level, predominantly crates, as you'll have to alternate between phases on the fly to be able to complete certain obstacles. Then Akanu Dark Matter mask. This one allowing you to continuously spin, and so you're always attacking and also able to jump for much longer as you sort of glide. The challenge with this mask coming from exploding bombs at touch and enemies that can deflect this particular mask, sending you flying back. Then the Kupuna-Wa time mask. This one slows down time, used in very specific scenes where the platforms are just going at an impossible to use speed and slowing them down for a short period of time. The challenge here comes mostly from the timings of when to slow down time, especially as later on you will have a lot of scenes where you end up in a falling or destroying platform that only works for a very limited amount of time. And also, of course, just simple doing the platforming while the mask is working, since it only works in short bursts. And then the Ika-Ika gravity mask, which explains itself, but for the sake of this review, well, it changes gravity. This being used in areas that have both a floor and a ceiling that can be platformed on, but sometimes there isn't a ceiling, adding to the challenge as you can only change gravity 2 times consecutively. Now, important to mention, these masks will show up at certain points and they can show up in 3D or 2D settings, as they're not limited by that perspective. And these masks are the real challenge of the game, as it adds another thing on your mind over the already challenging gameplay here. And when they start mixing them up in the later levels, it really becomes something. In terms of difficulty, Crash 4 is hard, but because of a generous checkpoint system, it never becomes too frustrating. In fact, if you die too many times, the game will introduce a checkpoint in between the regular checkpoints and give you an Aku Aku mask, which I have not mentioned yet, as it is the Aku Aku. And it does what it does in other games, which is simply a protection that allows you to get hit without immediately losing a life. And if you get multiple Aku Aku masks, you can eventually reach an invincible status for a limited amount of time, not protecting you from holes though. But in this case you don't lose life, since this game doesn't have a life system and you just restart at a checkpoint. But if you hate yourself, you can always play on classic difficulty, where upon death you have to restart the entire level. Now let's move on and talk about the extra playable characters. These ones only show up for about 2 missions each in the main story, but do have a lot of extra levels. This is, I believe, so it's not forcing you to play this Crash game with characters that aren't Crash, but I do recommend playing these extra levels, as they do add a nice level of variety to the game, being that while their level designs are quite similar, the way they actually play isn't. First we have Tauna, or Tauna, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, but it's not the Tauna from other Crash games, as this one comes from a different universe, which is what the story is all about. And it's kind of funny, this one being a lot more independent and capable over the damsel in distress that was the original character. Her moveset consists of a kick that has a bit larger range than the Crash's spin, and she is also able to wall jump in specific areas. And more importantly, she has a hook shot, which can be used for both platforming and attacking. And she is, at the end of the day, the most familiar character to play with, being a Bandicoot with those nice little gimmicks. And her character is quite fun, being that subversion of the original Tawna, who was a character very much of its time, let's say. Then we have Dingodile, a boss from Crash 3, now a playable character. He has a vacuum and he sucks. No, I'm just kidding. He's much slower than any other character, which can be a bit jarring, but again, also a bit of a nice change of pace. With its vacuum, he can suck crates and use explosive crates as projectiles, and also then use the vacuum as a glider, which is pretty funny, even though the gliding is a bit weird to get used to, due to an ending animation that has Dingodile doing a short ending jump that can kind of throw you off. And also, sometimes you just activate that ending jump on accident, sending you into an endless pit. He's not a bad character though, I swear. And then finally we have Cortex, the main villain of the series, here as a playable character. And he is actually the most interesting and unique, while still being fairly familiar to the Crash series gameplay. This character basically moves like Crash, except he doesn't have a double jump, instead he has a dash. The dash being very self-explanatory, it's really what compensates for the lack of a double jump, allowing you to clear those longer jumps, but of course without having the height capability, with the gun serving to fix that, as this gun does not do damage to enemies, instead it turns them into platforms. Either rock platforms, which are just regular and motionless things to jump on, but then if shot again they turn into jelly, which allows you to jump extra high. So Cortex ends up having a similar gameplay to Crash while having a completely different approach to level design. Speaking of level design, to finish this bit off of gameplay, I want to talk about the collectibles and replayability. Crash is challenging, but it can also be beaten in a day easily. But actually completing it will easily triple your time with this game, if not more. Getting all the collectibles and doing all the challenges like playing the levels mirrored will take a long time, more than I was willing to put into it, as it turns an already challenging game into a true nightmare, so be aware of that if that's something you want to do. And there's also a local multiplayer mode called Bandicoot Battles, but it's really thrown in. It's just 2 players battling in time trials, and I didn't bother too much with it. So that's all I have to say, honestly. Now, the graphics and sound of this game. Graphically, this game looks great. It's very vibrant and full of small details with large variety of locations. They are very reminiscent of that PS1/PS2 era of 3D platformers, with jungles, snow and sewers, or a mad scientist lab, but without the problems those games often suffered of. Some of these locations looking somewhat uninspired, as even the sewer levels here look pretty great. Even on the Switch it looks good, and mostly due to the cartoony look, which doesn't require that high fidelity to look good. And yes, I played the Switch version. Now the music, honestly, it falls in the same category. It's very nostalgic to the Crash sound with a lot of drums. This soundtrack surely loves the drums. It sounds good, and that's really all I have to say about it. And hopefully this is all I have to say about this game, because now it's the point where we score this game, and I'm giving Crash 4 It's About Time an 8 out of 10. It's a really good comeback for this series, and I'm very impressed with Toys for Bob, and I think this might be their breakthrough into making their own games. At least that's what I hope it happens. Now, in terms of recommendations, if you're a Crash fan, then you probably already played this, and if not, then do, of course. If you're not a Crash fan, then the Insane Trilogy should be your starting place. I think that one is a very friendly and modern entry point into this series, and there is a lot of content in that game already. for a much lower price, given it is basically 3 games. So I would recommend playing that first and then coming and playing this one, especially since regardless of what modern console you're on, you can play either of these games. And in terms of the Switch port for Crash 4, it was surprisingly good. It's very smooth, and I didn't feel like there was a big sacrifice to visual quality again, helped by the style of the game, of course. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that this video helped you make it, and regardless of that, I hope you consider subscribing and liking and even commenting all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.